In this video, we'll explore Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness in its entirety, which in the translation I'm using is over 600 pages. Regular viewers of this channel know that I typically avoid summaries of this magnitude, focusing on smaller sections of text, and there is a series of videos where I do just that for this work. For those who have watched that series, you can consider this a kind of wrap up of what we've covered. Alternatively, you can skip to the next part of this video where I discuss Sartre's conclusions in the book, as well as some of my own reflections about being and nothingness. Many first encounter Sartre by either watching an online summary or reading his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, delivered publicly in 1945. And this is a good starting point. However, the language and some ideas in the essay will seem distant from what we encounter in Being and Nothingness. In contrast to what some might assume, Being and Nothingness is not a guide on how to live your life. It is a philosophical text that explores the fundamental a priori structures and principles grounding our practical endeavors. The language is abstract, even as it uses concrete examples to develop its ideas. And even when it's talking about the concrete, it's done in a way that will appear to most as abstract language. Sartre's notion of radical freedom is often misunderstood as a kind of freedom without constraints. However, as we discover in this text, freedom only exists in the presence of constraints, such as the body, others, culture, and environment. Sartre's thinking is also notoriously difficult to pin down because it employs a form of dialectical thinking, presenting contradictions like freedom, determinism, self, other, and subjectivity, objectivity, without resolving them in favor of one side. Yeah, sure, freedom, self, and subjectivity do seem to be prioritized by him, but for this reason, the reader can be misled or confused by many passages in this text that seem to contradict this priority. Understanding his philosophy requires appreciating the dynamic and inseparable relationships between these opposing concepts, which is more difficult for our minds to get wrapped around than what dualistic or monistic thinking typically allows for. Sartre was pivotal in introducing phenomenology into French philosophy. His particular approach to phenomenology, informed by Edmund Husserl, focuses on consciousness and the intentional acts by which objects are experienced. This consciousness of something and the method of rigorously describing lived experience are important starting points and methods for Sartre in Being and Nothingness, though he will be critical of Husserl's approach, especially what he considers his idealism. However, Sartre does not limit himself to phenomenology alone. He's interested in what appears, not just appearances. To avoid the idealist position that everything is merely its appearance, we must consider what lies beyond appearance, leading us to ontology and the discovery of the transphenomenal. Transphenomenal refers to something that precedes knowledge and appearances, and yet is the condition of their possibility. Something has to be for it to appear and then be known by us. This move to ontology and the concern with being marks Heidegger's influence on Sartre's thought. However, their approaches are vastly different, as Sartre is concerned principally with individual concrete beings and the being of consciousness, a word that you will never see in Heidegger. The being of consciousness, or transphenomenal consciousness, is a pure, directed, immediate awareness of something other than itself. Transphenomenal consciousness is prior to knowledge of objects, and this consciousness is not an object to itself, but it is logically necessary to presuppose it as a condition for any object to appear to consciousness at all, including itself. A distinctive element of human consciousness, however, is also its reflexivity, which creates a split between the consciousness that reflects the subject and the consciousness reflected upon the object. Transphenomenal consciousness or pre-reflective consciousness precedes this act of reflection and is always present behind this reflecting act. Being for itself, one of the key concepts in this work, includes both this pre-reflective consciousness and the reflective consciousness. It entails the active movement of being able to lift oneself from our immediate awareness or transphenomenal consciousness and reflect upon it, thereby expressing oneself as freedom. Indeed, being for itself is not something, an object, but this very act of freedom expressing itself. It's a constant movement towards something other than itself through transcendence. It's also the case that the gap created between the reflecting and what is reflected upon marks being for itself with a fundamental misalignment, a disturbed form of self-relating that constitutes our fundamentally problematic relationship with ourselves, since I am never at one with myself. In other words, what I reflect upon is me and not me at the same time. It is an object that I make of myself, an ego, but it's not the one who is looking at this ego. And we experience this discrepancy. And we'll talk soon about how this points to lack and desire. Now, this misalignment is, so to speak, a blessing and a curse, since there can be no consciousness and freedom without this split. And yet this split is the source of my anguish and despair. The second category of the transphenomenal is the being of the phenomenon, or being in itself. It is the existence of things as they are prior to and independent of their appearances to consciousness. While being in itself is not the object as known, it is necessary to posit it, as it's the condition of possibility for both the phenomenon and consciousness. And it's the possibility for consciousness because being for itself emerges out of the being in itself. Yet it is being for itself that will fundamentally transform being in itself by introducing into it notions of change, cause, activity, and incompleteness, all characteristics that being in itself does not have. Instead, being in itself is inert, static, without differentiation or potential for becoming something else. It requires nothing outside of itself for it to be, and simply exists as itself. Now, you might say, things in the world change, the rock gets worn down into sand, all that. But the idea that something becomes something else, that there's a transformation, all that is not something that the rock is aware of. These are not concepts that the rock has intrinsic to it. It's what we bring to the rock in its different states. And the fact that we think of a rock as separate from the rest of the environment in which we find it is part of our consciousness introducing something into the being in itself that allows it to separate out different objects in it. A third category of the transphenomenal is nothingness. Nothingness cannot be described on its own terms, as it logically follows from, presupposes, and is parasitic upon being. Nonetheless, nothingness is a necessarily presupposed idea in our relationships with ourselves and other beings. This is evident in the category of beings grouped under the title négativité, a French word that is left untranslated. Négativité can include an example such as a straight line, which we might positively define by its length. But its length is established by the nothingness that separates its 2 points, its endpoints. Similarly, and perhaps a little bit more easier to get our minds wrapped around, is the crescent moon, which is understood not only by what it shows, but also by what is missing, marking a synthesis of being and nothingness. Now, while these examples demonstrate the logical necessity of nothingness in our understanding of certain beings, we can still be led to question the philosophical significance of nothingness. For Sartre, its relevance lies in the fact that nothingness is exclusively a human reality, And so calling nothingness a third category of the trans phenomena is somewhat misleading, since it is only through being for itself that nothingness enters the world. There is no line or crescent moon absent human reality. And yet, dialectically, these beings are not subjective, but belong to being in itself, but being in itself as annihilated. Similarly, concepts like fragility and destruction are introduced by us. And so to be human is to be the conduit through which nothingness permeates the whole world. If nothingness inherently belongs to us, then we must be the kind of being capable of introducing it into the world. A rock doesn't introduce nothingness. What enables us to annihilate being in itself is freedom and transcendence. So, what are these? Freedom is a fundamental condition of being for itself that entails the capacity to make choices, to change something from what it is to something which it is not yet. It's an expression of possibility. And possibility, as possibility, lacks being, if we define being as what is actual. Thus, freedom introduces nothingness into being, allowing that being or myself to become something else. How do we experience this freedom? Sartre says it's through anguish. Now, why is that? Because being radically free, as Sartre describes it, means confronting the terrifying reality that nothing fundamentally stops us from doing anything. Sartre's example is my standing on the ledge of a tall building. The anguish comes not from the fear of falling, but from the possibility that I could choose to leap. There is nothing that necessarily compels me not to jump, and I am faced with the necessity of making a choice at every moment. Realizing this freedom induces a sense of vertigo. Of course, we might tell ourselves that our survival instinct would prevent us from jumping, implying we have no real choice. Or we could even go so far as to deny the danger of the height, convincing ourselves that it's not so perilous. In doing this, in denying either our freedom or the facts of the situation, what we call our facticity, is what Sartre calls bad faith. Bad faith is a kind of self-deception in which I lie to myself to avoid the anguish associated with my radical freedom, failing to acknowledge the intimate synthesis between freedom and facticity. And in deceiving myself, I'm also aware of deceiving myself. And this is the challenge in doing it, is that I'm always undermining the very act of bad faith because I'm aware I'm doing it to myself on some level, often on the pre-reflective level of consciousness, which I'm trying to hide from this knowledge. I mentioned the word facticity, so let me define that more precisely. It is the in itself resurfacing after the for itself has introduced nothingness into it. Sartre calls it what haunts the being for itself. It refers to the concrete dimensions of my existence, and it serves as both a resistance to and a condition of possibility for my freedom. For example, my body is necessary for me to act in the world, but also in its particular form, its contingency, how tall I am, what color my skin is, what genetics I have. All this can serve as an obstacle that must be overcome to express my possibilities. So, facticity is characterized by necessity and contingency. Now, I mentioned that nothingness is introduced by freedom and transcendence. Now, transcendence is the second facet that makes annihilation possible for being for itself. Though intimately related to freedom, transcendence refers to the activity of the for itself going beyond pre-reflective consciousness and projecting itself toward what it is not. Transcendence expresses itself through negation, of which there are two categories: external negation and internal negation. An example of external negation is saying that a pen is not a bird. This type of negation establishes a bond between two beings without modifying them or, in particular, myself. The being of each object remains untouched. So I can say these two objects are 10 feet apart. That 10 feet apart, which is a way of describing space, is an external negation without any modification of being itself. Internal negation, in contrast, influences the inner structure of being, and it's a relation where one being is defined by its lack of the other. For example, saying, I am not my past negates something about my being that affects me now. My past self is something I am, but also something I lack. And encountering this lack frees me from my past self to become something new. Similarly, saying I am not this book right here is not first an objective statement concerning a neutral state of affairs, but an act of differentiation whereby I identify myself in relation to this book through the negation. To say I am not this book is to say the book is something I lack in myself. It is to say something about what the book then means to me, how it concerns me, how it might, through the knowledge it gives me, become in some way part of my being. Through internal negation, beings then reveal themselves through their qualities, which not only discloses aspects of the in itself, but also reflects my values, preferences, aversions, thereby giving meaning to my life. So if this, for example, if this book and am I negating it reveals itself as something readable, which it may be a debatable uh, observation, it then suggests something meaningful to me as readable, that I could read it, then perhaps I want to read it or I don't want to read it. And why I want to read it or don't want to read it says something about my values and the kind of meaning I'm giving to this book. So, in talking about internal negation, we describe it as giving rise to a lack in the being for itself. And this lack is encountered primarily as desire. And what does that mean? The for itself defines itself by negating what it is not. I am not this camera. I am not this other person. I am not this book. I am not who I was. I'm not that fool anymore. This nothingness that defines me leaves me wanting to fill it, to no longer be this lack. To answer the question, for example, well, if I'm not this fool, who am I? Yet we can never fully arrive there either, and we know it. There is no point while alive where we are fully aligned with ourselves, no longer striving to be something we are not. Our awareness of this impossible project makes our consciousness fundamentally unhappy, perpetually haunted by the specter of completeness or totality it can never achieve, and yet must incessantly aim to become. And this is the fundamental misalignment I talked about earlier. Desire is the human expression of this lack. What I desire is an unactualized possibility, an element of the for itself that escapes it, and that is located in the in itself. Thus, I am defined by my possibilities and consequently by the part of myself I am not. Temporality is the means by which my possibilities appear to me within the horizon of the world, making those possibilities mine. In Sartre's view, temporality is not a standalone, but a characteristic of the for itself, manifesting in an ecstatic or self-distancing relationship toward the past and future. He describes three modes of ecstasis. First, to not be what it is. This pertains to the past, which the for itself must negate to be itself. As long as I'm alive, I am not my past, but also have a complex relationship with it since it is me as well. Or more accurately, it constitutes my essence or how I define myself. And for me to become something else, I have to negate this essence, negate my past. And this leads me into this ever present tension of both being and not being my past. And this is captured by the past tense of the verb to be, which is was. To say I was a fool marks a unique synthesis of present as the act of speaking here and now, and past as the object of the sentence. The was connects these two parts of the sentence. Two, to be what it is not. This pertains to the future, as the for itself strives for what it lacks. The future is something one is perpetually becoming, and it's influenced by our present actions and choices, but also haunted by the constant possibility of not achieving it. And this leads to an ontological disillusionment as the present self never quite matches the future self it aspires to be. 3, to be what it is not, and not be what it is. This pertains to the present, where the for itself embodies all modes of temporality. The present is where the for itself realizes itself and experiences its being as an ongoing process of becoming, shaped by its past and future. My present is not merely a temporal moment, but a manifestation of my presence, the presence of the for itself to the in itself. An ontological relationship of synthesis where I relate not only to a particular being in itself, but also to the entirety of the in itself. The present is also the only place where the past and future converge in this ontological relationship. And so, unlike Heidegger, who prioritizes the future, Sartre prioritizes the present as the locus of where everything happens. Now, being for itself is not only in a relationship of transcendence toward being in itself, but is also in a relation of transcendence with other consciousnesses as being for itself. A unique dimension of this relationship is that I can negate the other in affirming my subjectivity and freedom, but the other can also negate me in affirming their subjectivity and freedom. I encounter their transcending negation through the gaze. The gaze is not an object in the world, like a set of physical eyes, but an experience I undergo when I find myself being looked at by the other, even if no one is physically present. This being seen by the other is most directly experienced as shame, where I recognize myself as an object in the eyes of another, and my possibilities and freedom are halted by this gaze. And for this reason, the other is the source of my alienation. This fundamental and inescapable dimension of my existence is called being for others. And it's characterized by conflict, since both subjects are in a dialectical tension of seeing and being seen, transcending and being transcended, negating and being negated. Now, before discussing the different expressions of this conflictual relation, Sartre introduces the body as integral to it, identifying 3 distinct bodies. 1, the body as being for itself. This is the most fundamental way we live our bodies, which are inseparable from our subjectivity and which is only revealed to us through interactions with other beings in the world. This is what he calls the body in action, and it's at one with consciousness and its acts of transcendence. Second, there is the other's body as it is for me. Here, the body appears as an object that can be observed and used, an instrument by which I can express my possibilities, but also can entail the negation of the other's subjectivity in order to relate to this body as such. 3, my body as it is for others. So just like the other's body can be for me, my body can also become an object for the other. This is perhaps the sense of our body that we most readily experience and think about. It's the body we read about in science and that we then look upon our own bodies as. But this is an alienated body, since it's the body that I inherit from others. And to identify with this body requires a negation of my subjectivity and freedom. This body for the other is something I then absorb as my own perspective, especially through language. And it's whereby I can now name its parts, describe its functions, treat it as something separate from me, something I have rather than something I am. Now, even though there is this vacillation between my body as an object and my body as lived, or the other as a bodily object and the other as a transcending gaze, it is impossible to fully negate subjectivity. I cannot be a consciousness without the other to recognize me as a gaze for them. And thus, I require their subjectivity while seeking to negate it at the same time. And the same holds true for the other. Nonetheless, there are attempts to reconcile this dialectical tension in the mode of bad faith. Before addressing these attempts, though, I want to mention one other concept, which is the flesh. which expresses itself in at least two ways. First, there is the flesh of the other. And here I encounter the other's body as a synthetic totality with their consciousness. The caress, which is a concept that Sartre talks about, and it can be expressed whether physically or through language, is what reaches out to the other to incarnate their flesh, whereby I then experience them as this synthetic totality of body as object and body as lived subjectivity. And conversely, there is my flesh as incarnated through the other, who, through their caress, awakens my flesh in the same way, allowing me to experience my own flesh and them to experience my experiencing of it. Now, with this in mind, we can discuss the three modes or attitudes of our being for others. First, there is love, or wanting to be loved. In love, I seek to be the object of the other's affection while maintaining my own subjectivity and ensuring the other maintains theirs, which means maintaining their freedom, because a love that is unfree is not love. Yet, love introduces some unique tensions as I demand that the other love me not only for the moment, but for always. A temporary love is not love. However, the other cannot promise this without negating their own freedom, since their future love needs to be freely chosen and not compelled by some past promise. And when they do freely choose to love me, their expression of freedom always risks turning me into a mere object for them, jeopardizing my subjectivity. Now, this can culminate in masochism, wherein in bad faith, I freely choose to become that object for the other, actively seeking to annihilate my own subjectivity. Second, there's desire, which involves wanting to possess the other as an object for me, and in doing so, experience their subjectivity by incarnating their flesh and mind. This mutual incarnation, where each consciousness realizes the other's incarnation through the caress, is also precarious and can lead to sadism, wherein, again, in bad faith, one relates to the other purely as an object of one's own satisfaction, and through which I seek to fully affirm my freedom by denigrating theirs. And yet, I can never denigrate their freedom and subjectivity without also then losing mine. So this leads us to the third attitude, hate. Hate is the culmination of the impossibility of love and desire and their variations in sadism and masochism, leading to an attempt to fully destroy the other, thereby affirm my own being. So if I cannot rid myself of the risk of losing my freedom due to the inherent dialectical tensions and conflicts in my concrete relations with others, then the only option left for me is to destroy the other. And to destroy the other is not merely about this particular person, but having this particular person symbolically represent the elimination of the presence of all others, all gazes. And this is done to reclaim my freedom from the perceived enslavement of that alienating gaze. However, once again, like love and desire, hate ultimately fails because there is no escape from the gaze. And as such, hate ultimately can culminate in despair. Another dimension of our being with others occurs not just in the dyad of self and other, but when a collection of consciousnesses forms a shared identity. The concept of the we subject signifies a community of consciousnesses recognizing each other as subjectivities rather than objects. This collective arises in shared experiences like spectators at a performance or a religious community during liturgy. The we experience operates to transcend individual rivalries and unite subjects in common actions, perceptions, and purposes. Now, while the we subject is defined by a collective gaze directed toward an object, the us object is experienced when we collectively become objects for others. A critical dimension of this us object experience is the arrival of the third. The third gazes upon this dyad, leading to a shared sense of alienation that gives rise to the collective. And one of Sartre's examples here is class consciousness, which arises when individuals within an oppressed group recognize their collective alienation through the perspective of a third, an external observer representing here the oppressing class. The final part of Being and Nothingness addresses having, doing, and being as encompassing the totality of human activities. These categories are founded on radical freedom and express our essence and form the basis for an original choice that structures all our decisions and actions. This original choice or project is a desire for being. Let's recall that being for itself is a lack, seeking to establish itself in being to eliminate that lack. Yet doing so would also eliminate consciousness. My desire for being is an impossible and contradictory aim to be fully unified with myself while maintaining my freedom as a subject. And Sartre names this aim God. Thus, I desire to be God, and all my actions lead me to this original project and choice. Now, while Sartre affirms radical freedom, it is not without constraints. Freedom requires resistance to be meaningful. Otherwise, it has nothing to be free from or free for. This resistance arises from our facticity, which, when in conflict with our freedom, forms what he calls our situation. And there are different facets of this situation, including our place in the world, our past, our environment, and other human beings who impose constraints on our freedom and constraints on our ability to create our own meanings in life. Existential psychoanalysis is a method that helps individuals examine the symbolic significance of their actions, decisions, and reactions in response to their situations. It assumes that every act, no matter how small, expresses a fundamental choice concerning our desire for being. In other words, it considers the multifaceted ways we seek to become God, a self-sufficient, non-lacking, complete being who is nonetheless completely free. This aim is unrealizable, and our attempts to ignore its impossibility often lead to bad faith. Bad faith here is a protective mechanism guarding against the anxiety of our radical freedom, as we've already mentioned, and the despair that life lacks ultimate meaning. And this is because ultimately it is up to each of us in our freedom, as it meets the resistances of our situations, to create meanings for ourselves, however precarious they may be. For those who have watched the other videos in this series, we've covered now all sections of Being and Nothingness except for the conclusion, which consists of two relatively short sections wherein Sartre raises some questions concerning metaphysics and ethics. And the following will briefly examine these sections. In the conclusion of Being and Nothingness, Sartre addresses a potential concern about introducing a dualism between being for itself and being in itself. He clarifies that the for itself is not separate from the in itself, but is the in itself nihilated. The for itself has no reality save that of being the nihilation of being. So the for itself is a void at the heart of being, and as Sartre suggests earlier in the text, a parasite upon the in itself, lacking any independent existence. So it makes no sense to question the connection between the for itself and the in itself or worry about dualism, since the for itself is not an autonomous substance. This does lead to another metaphysical question, though. Why does the for itself emerge from the in itself in the first place? Sartre's initial response is that this question is meaningless, since it can only be posed by the for itself. Asking what precedes the for itself inserts the for itself, or nothingness, before being itself. A more pertinent question then is, why is there being at all? And Sartre answers that by saying that being exists because of the for itself, through which being is made manifest. So that is hard to get our minds wrapped around and a little confusing. A generous interpretation of Sartre's responses here to these questions he poses to himself might entail comparing such questions to asking an astrophysicist what happened before the Big Bang. A reply I see commonly to this question is that the question is nonsensical because time itself began with the Big Bang, and asking about before presupposes that time precedes it, which contradicts the astrophysical understanding of time. Similarly, there is no before of the dialectical relation of the for itself and the in itself. It is the necessary starting point for all thought. And Sartre's response is also fairly consistent with phenomenology. In phenomenology, we bracket such why questions because there is no question that does not already presuppose the consciousness of a questioner that, in a sense, contaminates the question, especially if the question is asking about something that precedes conscious experience. We could contrast this reply with the one we find in Zizek in the parallax view. So Zizek, who is not beholden to phenomenological presuppositions and yet who also proposes a conception of consciousness that has points of convergence with Sartre, is willing to go the extra step to claim that the reason subjectivity emerges from inert materiality in the first place is due to inherent ontological incompleteness within being itself, and the incompleteness of the human animal in particular. As such, Zizek is willing to affirm a non-reductive materialism and thus preserve the contradiction of the dialectic internal to one of the terms, while Sartre seems to want to maintain a synthesis of the dialectic that keeps them together in a mutually influencing manner. At least that's my initial read of the differences between the two. In section 2, Sartre asserts that one cannot derive ethics from ontology, and this is commonly called the is-ought problem, that you can't derive what you ought to do from what is. However, ontology can reveal the conditions and structural features of existence that makes an ethics possible, especially as it relates to value. Value originates from a lack perceived by the for itself, which elicits a desire to strive for something. For example, the lack of justice in the world forms the basis for the value of justice, guiding the for itself and seeking to actualize an absent totality. Existential psychoanalysis aims to describe the ethical meaning of our projects, showing that our actions always express our values, even when we ignore or try to hide their connection. Existential psychoanalysis also repudiates what Sartre calls the spirit of seriousness, which treats values as if they were transcendent givens independent of consciousness, and that often locates desire in empirical material reality. So, for example, bread is seen as desirable because it is necessary for life and nourishment. This view loses the symbolic value of bread as it relates to our desire for being itself. And existential psychoanalysis aims to help individuals realize that they are the beings through whom value exists, and as the unique source of value, are responsible for choosing their values. And this responsibility to freely choose one's values gives them their weight, as opposed to those values being imposed externally or reduced to mere biological drives and external exigencies. So we've finally reached the end. It took a year and almost 2 months to get here. As is often the case, after finishing a book of this magnitude, I look back feeling like a changed thinker. Immersing yourself so thoroughly in another's thought is like entering a new world and language and gradually orienting yourself to it, discovering new ways of seeing one's old world. And when you return, you're just not the same thinker. That said, there's a lot I don't agree with that Sartre has to say. And I entertained many questions and doubts along the way, which I had to bracket to let the text speak for itself as best as I could. Now that it's done, I'll mention briefly a couple of those doubts and questions. And one of those is one I share perhaps with Levinas, and that is concerning the characterization of the intersubjective relation in being for others. Sartre does a good job showing how solipsism is a mistaken perspective, as we are necessarily always in a relation to and constituted by the other. However, I don't think his approach sufficiently recognizes how much more fundamental the other is. And I don't think his characterizing this relation in terms of conflict is the most fundamental way of describing this relation. The conflictual nature of this relationship emerges out of his understanding of the gaze as a source of shame and turning us into an object. And this is certainly a valid description of a way in which our everyday interactions go. But Levinas's point, I believe, is that the gaze operates first at a more fundamental level to awaken my subjectivity, to confer upon me my freedom and responsibility. And so, if anything, the for itself does not emerge out of the in itself, but in fact is an event of the other. And my freedom, which is gifted to me, is not first, but is secondary to an ethical responsibility to the other. A second area of doubt concerns Sartre's views on the unconscious and his notion of bad faith, and this dovetails with my first point. If the other precedes me in the Levinasian sense, and in the Lacanian sense, if the other is not just another subjectivity, but also a discourse that precedes and determines me, then consciousness itself is a secondary revision of this primary encounter with the other. Now, Lacan took Sartre's critique of the unconscious very seriously, and it likely shaped his own formulation of the unconscious to address Sartre's objections. As such, in Lacan, we see the unconscious situated not as something internal to consciousness or a split off part that consciousness is not aware of inside itself, but as something external. And we can start to hear the unconscious in Sartre when he talks about language as a source of alienation deriving from the other. And in a similar vein, for Lacan, the unconscious is primarily linguistic, a discourse of the other wherein the effects of speech, and more specifically the signifier, produces a subject. And so, like with Levinas, we're once again discovering a subject born of the other and not the in itself. Next, we explore Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, a text highly indebted to Being and Nothingness, but which also very much critiques many of Sartre's notions, such as freedom, Sartre's overemphasis on the visual over other modalities of perception, and his approach to embodiment. I look forward to having you join in that next journey that we'll be taking very soon. If this video and the other videos in the series were helpful, many ways you can support this work: liking and sharing, subscribing if you haven't already, and you can make financial contributions in a couple ways. One is through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube, and you can also do so on Patreon, where there are different tiers offering video transcripts, unedited materials, prioritizing questions and comments here on YouTube, posting extra material from these recordings. And I'd like to thank the following for already supporting this work over on Patreon. And as always, thanks for watching. Until next time, be well.